Welcome to everybody to the first of two events on the topic of housing in Europe, from financialization to mobilization, followed by a second event webinar on housing mobilization on June 17th, both organized by UTH. So before to start, Simone already introduced it, but please be aware that the event will be recorded and will be available on the ICS website. I here put in the messages our link. So for who doesn't know, the Urban Transition Hub is a group of researchers that is based in the Institute of Social Science of the University of Lisbon, within the research group of Environment, Territory and Society. And the groups focus on urbanization and sustainable transitions with an interdisciplinary approach to tackle its criticalities and crises. And the group is intended as a hub since it seeks to build connections and cooperation with other research realities within Portugal and abroad on the many research topics we tackle, that it's from housing and urban change to participatory and territorial governance, from sustainability and urban transformation to nature and the city, with an overall aim and intent to explore theory and methods and practice that contribute on shaping more equitable and sustainable solution. And I will also share with you our website for who is interested in knowing more. So, okay, today we present the report on financialization on housing in Southern Europe with a brief introduction by Simone Tulumello from ICS-ULisboa and part of the Urban Transition Hub. And then we really welcome our four speakers of today, Thomas Maloutas from the Harokopio University of Athens, Sonia Arbaci from the University College London, García Lamarca from the Universitat Autònoma de Barcelona, and Manuel Aalbers from KU Leuven. So the structure of the event will be a brief introduction. The intervention will take approximately 10 minutes each. And then we will open the floor for comments and questions and debate for about 30 minutes at the end of the event. So now I leave the floor to Simone Tulumello that will introduce the event of today.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Luisa, for the introduction. Just to mention that the original idea of this couple of events was actually Luisa's, who's our colleague at ICS and UTH, and that she was thinking about organizing the second event, the one is going to be in 8 days on the 17th on mobilization. And so then we decided to do this couple of events and join a more historical, analytical dimension, and then a more present dimension on present mobilization on housing in times of COVID-19. So I will be quite brief because I don't want to take space from, I'm very honored to have such an amazing panel today. Sonia, Thomas, Manuel, and Melissa are, I mean, some of my heroes, no, since I started working on this topic. So it's one of those moments in which, also thanks to these digital instruments, we can all together discuss on these issues. This report, the institutional dimensions, it has been funded by José Gusmão. He's a member of the European Parliament from the left in the European Parliament. He should be here actually and commenting at the end of the session, but I haven't seen it, but well, he's gonna pop up at a certain moment. And he and his colleagues at the Bloco de Esquerda, the Portuguese party, have challenged me last year to do this short projects and focusing on finances linked to housing in a way that could be relevant for European housing policies. And so we decided together with, then we built up a small team. And so I would like to mention Myrto Dagkouli-Kyriakoglou, who should also be here, who's the co-author of the report, and then Alessandro Colombo, who supported the collection of data on the case of Italy, and Marco Allegra, who was the advisor. And so what did we do? We realized that there is a lot of literature recently on housing financialization. I mean, in the last 10 years, I would say there's been an impressive growth of relevance of this research topic because of the growing relevance of the issue, of the political economic matter of housing financialization. And there is also a growing, and to my understanding, very important literature on housing financialization in Southern Europe, of which some of the authors here have been part, which has been starting to open up to a field which has been relatively less explored in international literature on housing financialization, which is the role of the state. Not that the state has been completely neglected. I remember a paper by Manuel Aalbers, I think in 2017, where he mentioned, look, the state, we are starting to think about it, but maybe we should be doing more. In fact, when you start reading on housing financialization in Southern Europe, the state is much more central. And so that say, well, maybe by inquiring the role of state in Southern Europe, we can do a couple of things. First, trying to systematize the role of the public action in this large project of financialization, systematize and historicize it, not looking at it just in terms of what's going on today, but in terms of the long run of public policy transformations that are linked and to our understanding have fostered, if not even created, the grounds in many contexts for housing financialization. And second, further contribute to build a more global understanding of housing financialization. For instance, breaking the traditional dichotomy between the global north and the global south, which urban scholars in Southern Europe have long been concerned with by looking at this region, which is somehow at the frontier between these two worlds, at least in terms of urban development, of housing developments. So what we did was basically collecting some 50 years of legislation of state acts linked to matters of financialization in 4 countries, in Portugal, in Spain, in Italy, and in Greece. And on the grounds of this, we started to organize, systematize, precisely as I said, the role of the state in housing financialization. And we came to the conclusion that it was important to try and separate modes of housing financialization. This is something, if you look at literature, there are a lot of cases on many different specific topics. Yeah. But what has not been done in a systematic way was trying to look at how financialization systematically works differently when home ownership is concerned, when securitization is concerned, when social housing is concerned, etc. And so for this theoretical dimension, we started from a report that Manuel Aalbers wrote in 2019, whose goal was to systematize literature on housing financialization that we needed to give more nuance to. Of course, Manuel's goal at the time wasn't to identify fields of state action, but rather organize the literature. But on those grounds, basically, we came out with the idea of 6 large fields where the action of the state and the processes of financialization are somehow independent from each other. Of course, there are connections, and in fact, policies. But in fact, and I will close by just mentioning these 6 dimensions, which is, like I said, mortgage debt, the most known and long-term dynamic of housing financialization, securitization of mortgage debt, definancialization of social housing, the financialization of market rental housing, the financialization of housing companies in and of themselves, which is maybe of this the least present process in Southern Europe. And finally, we decided also to add the financialization and empty housing. And on the grounds of this, we could build up, in a sense, the history of policies for housing financialization in these 4 countries. And I think this is enough for opening up the field for discussion, because I'm quite sure that by commenting on it, our 4 speakers will provide more details and even more details on different national and local contexts. I will just drop here on the link the report and a short article that summarizes this conceptual framework. More articles will follow in the next months and years. And so as we agreed, I will give the floor to Thomas for the first of the interventions, right?
Yes, exactly. Please, Thomas.
Hello, everyone. First of all, thank you very much for this invitation. And it was a good occasion to read this report. And I really enjoyed reading it because, first of all, it describes the different forms of financialization of housing and makes clear what we're talking about, even for non-experts of financialization like myself. The second is that the report discusses financialization for a particular region, Southern Europe, and thus it reveals the importance of context, discussing the differences with other regions and discussing also the differences and the similarities among the countries of Southern Europe. Third, the report also discusses financialization over a long period of time, several decades, and thus reveals also the importance of time. Fourth, the report makes clear that the main question is what is the problem, which is also always the main question, and it focuses on the impact of financialization for the accessibility of affordable housing. Fifth, the report provides a clear understanding of the mechanism which leads to the problem. When housing is increasingly commodified and financialized, it becomes primarily a commodity whose production and circulation is offered to investors to handle in an increasingly unregulated way so that they maximize their profit. And thus, housing loses its use value and its property as a social and human right. Sixth, because financialization is mainly a political process, the report focuses on the role of the state and the role of suprastate entities like the European Union. And finally, the report deals with the potential ways this process should be transformed in order to stop or at least alleviate its negative effects. I will just make 3 or 4 comments on this last point, on the ways of mitigating or alleviating the effects of financialization, and the ways it can, this process can become less harmful to those who need housing the most. The first point is how can you really fight negative effects of financialization of housing, not only in Southern Europe, but anywhere? Financialization within globalization is a process liberating capital from former constraints related to the substance and temporality of investment and to local relations of power and regulations. In this way, it gives free hand to capital to focus on its main concern, maximize profit, without worrying about the substance of its investment. The free hand for capital to focus exclusively on maximizing private profit, leaving expenses and losses to be socialized, is not only hurting housing and other social services as social goods and rights, it is also undermining the growth process by obstructing, for example, innovation in the ways Mazzucato has nicely explained, reminding the old Marxist adage about social relations becoming an obstacle for productive forces. The question is whether financialization is intrinsically negative and must be fought and rejected as a whole, or is it the way that the financial sector is regulated which creates the problem? The first option gives the impression that we should be desperately fighting financial capitalism like the Luddites fought against the machines. The second option, based on the assumption that housing credit, for instance, could be a positive way to socially enhance accessibility to housing, if borrowing conditions were less prejudicial for borrowers, leads to fighting again in the opponent's field, with your team being outnumbered, often not having the right equipment for the game, and for a game you don't completely know the rules. Is this what socialist parties tried to do in the 90s? Or did they abandon the fight and accepted the opponent's rules from the start? In any case, fighting financial capitalism is definitely not an easy task. My second point is related to the first. If the financialization of housing is not mainly a technical and legal problem, but a political problem, what are the odds today to find a solution that would not be detrimental for those deprived of decent housing? The report sheds lights on the process of financialization in the four South European countries and the different forms it has undergone. It seems that the process was more direct and faster in Franco's Spain, where the regime was very close to the big players of finance, eventually leading to very unequal relations between lenders and borrowers, something portrayed even today by defaulting borrowers who lose their homes but remain in debt. In Italy, the financial instruments were more advanced, more complex, but the political climate and the power relations were more balanced, and eventually the social and economic outcome was much more negotiated. In Greece, almost up to the 90s, housing was a kind of playground for small players, small landowners and small builders, protected from the big players, like private banks, big construction firms, and big landowners. And financial tools existed, but they were handled only by the state. The populist right used housing as one of the main assets to handle the electoral vote. The domination of neoliberal ideas and policies have expanded the reach and transformed the social impact of financial tools related to housing, leading to a convergence among the four countries of the region, but also beyond. There is definitely no going back to the days when financial tools were less harmful. From societies numerically dominated by the working class, but socially mobile, we transited to societies dominated by intermediate strata, facing, however, increasingly uncertain mobilities and futures. The question is who, in sociological terms, gains and who loses today from the financialization of housing? What social alliances and divides can be produced from such states, and how can they be translated at different political levels? How many minutes do I have left?
You still have a couple of minutes left.
A couple of minutes. So I'll go immediately to the fourth point and leave you wonder what the third was. So the fourth and final point is about the COVID-19 and the future of housing and broader social policies. The pandemic has ambiguous effects on housing. On the one hand, On the one hand, it has hit much harder those in lower and precarious positions in the labor market, who often lost their income or part of it, and had increasing difficulties to sustain their position in the housing market, usually being tenants. On the other hand, the pandemic has literally stopped the process of short-term rentalization and the pressure of tenants, which followed from the substantial increase of tourist flows in the years before the pandemic. And this is very clear in countries like Portugal and Greece. The pressure on rental markets was not particularly regulated before the pandemic. Is it possible that regulation becomes a priority now? As the pandemic becomes contained and tourist flows start to resurge, it is doubtful that regulating them and the financial tools that go with them will become a priority. The discourse of conservative governments like the one in Greece is already stressing the need to face the economic damage left behind by the pandemic and to put the economy back on track. Other problems will be faced later if they are not automatically resolved by the reboosting of the market. To end all this, I would say that these questions are questions that the European left at the country level, as well as in the whole of the European Union, the European left should provide clear, persuasive, and politically mobilizing answers. And I think that this report can greatly contribute in that direction. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Thomas. And now, Sonia, we leave the floor to you. Thank
you. Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. Well, first of all, I would like to thank Simone, Luisa, and José for inviting me to this event and giving the opportunity to share thoughts in company of Melissa, Thomas, and Manuel. It's a big family here. I would like to start by congratulating Simone and Myrto for such an impressive and forward-thinking work. Bringing together such a vast collection of legislation and document analysis across 4 countries and languages and presenting this puzzle as a comprehensive Southern European panorama is just per se a really massive undertaking, impressive. What I found remarkable in this work is how from this knitting of regulations, programs, and practices, I would say, actually you have brought to the fore 2 important aspects. First, there is a clear message on the redistributive value of the housing system. And the fundamental questions we're posing on housing as a right versus a good of an asset goes actually beyond the financialization debate to call for a more universalist housing system. Regardless if universalism is just an aspiration or a feasible endeavor in the Southern European context, there is indeed a need to recenter the discourse at a systemic level if we really wish to address structural inequalities or specifically the affordability crisis and I think that this type of systemic discourse is still very incipient, especially in the policy arena and in our everyday life, perhaps because it's too complex to be put it in a tweet, I don't know. But I think that we need to voice it more through different channels while reaching out to different stakeholders and audiences at all levels, including and especially at the European level. Second, and following on this, well, you propose an incredible basket of policy recommendations that work in that direction. I would say perhaps a toolkit of tangible idea to start constructive discussions for forward-thinking policy responses. The big question is definitely how to rethink, operationalize, if you want, or universalists to follow your call in housing and welfare regime more broadly in other way, and in a post-forwarding financialized regime of accumulation. I believe the greatest values of your report is that it opens the door to this and other big discussions, as already also mentioned by Thomas, and courageously, I would say, put on the table propositional ideas. I just have one, let's say, academic comment if you want random thoughts. I think that your work offers a variety of potential contributions to academia, but I would like to stress one in particular. Not only this work is absolutely timely, but also break the pattern of scholarly production in housing studies, especially in comparative European studies, where the Southern European contribution used to join the international debate at a later stage. Often after broader theorization had been already shaped upon Northern European cases with the Anglo-Saxon scholarship setting the tone. Perhaps I feel the most this because of working in the UK and facing this almost every day. For a long time, housing studies have suffered from a sort of parochialism and ethnocentrism. They used to regard Southern European cases as variant or lagging behind in transition, and deem this peripheral to the process of theory formation. And in this sense, for instance, the work of Judith Allen, Jesus Leal, and Thomas Maloutas in 2004 was on the Southern European welfare housing axis was actually paramount in reframing the perspective, the focus, and setting more equal footing in the theory formation. I think a great value in the sense of Simone and Myrto work is that it catapults Southern European cases to the forefront of the current comparative conversation on housing financialization. And it does so at least in two ways. First, as you say, Simone, by opting for a historical perspective to knit together the 6 modes of financialization and cross-cutting issues. And in this way, it advanced the European debate to see financialization intrinsically linked to the multiple processes of recommodification of the housing system and other pillars of welfare regimes in the 70s and 80s, and which took different form and depth across European countries. Thus, financialization is neither recent nor an important process, but rather the result of contextual and institutional transformation and part of broader political economic choices on national, regional, and local government. And second, by the constructing the multifaceted role of the state as enabled produce, promoter, and shaper, it not only advanced the academic debate, but at the same time set the ground for various policy battleground at different levels. As we say, the devil is in the details. So I think that a fine-grained multi-scalar analysis of regulation and program, as you do, is in fact essential, but more so it is the way we investigate policy rather than looking at explicit policy objectives. It is indeed far more far-reaching to focus instead on the policy instrument. And your basket of policy recommendations draw in fact upon specific instruments, including those set at European level. And it also offered us a roadmap to potential area where to battle our way to a more universally system. Well, indeed, it is a fantastic work. To conclude, some thought that inspired by your policy recommendation. Well, it is needless to say that I fully share about the premises and the set of instruments that you are proposing. And now, if we think more broadly at your call for a more universalist, decommodified, definancialized housing system, I would like perhaps to reflect on 3 sine qua non conditions that made this possible in the past. Maybe these are become again some sort of priority possibility. It's paused and see whether actually there is ground out of way and in the Southern European context to steer us perhaps in this direction. Now, drawing on the case particularly on the corporatist and also the social democratic welfare state of Central and Northern Europe, 3 aspects emerged as essential. One was rent regulation. The second was land decommodification and a strong regulatory planning system when public land is scarce. And third, it was the integration of the profit and non-profit rental sector into a single rental market, the so-called unitary rental system that has a broader effect, not just on the rental market, but all the whole tenure system. Regarding regulation, perhaps it could be worth looking into more detail at the three-generation rent control we experience in Europe, because we have actually very interesting cases in terms of their design and their impact. In particular, the second generation, still in part present in France, Austria, the Netherlands, Denmark, or Germany, in which a set of regulations govern both the rent increase while ensuring and controlling a reasonable rate of return to landlords. Moreover, this type of rent control package is key to counteract the inflationary effect of rent subsidies, that being a big problem also for affordability. And its design is more flexible and adaptable to different contexts than the first generation rent control, where rents were frozen. Well, as we saw in Portugal, frozen rent is untenable on the medium long term due to its negative side effects. It's also created a very negative discourse. And at the same time, also the third generation of rent control that has been emerging in the last 10 years or so is more kind of a short-term rental break. It's only a restricted rent increase within tenancy, but not between tenancies. So I think there are some opportunity here perhaps to explore. Second, land decommodification is definitely the backbone of a universalist system. You cannot have one without the other. The question is, can we steer in that direction also in the South European context? I mean, the land system in the four countries, despite differences, has always been commodified, since the property regime is based on development gain rather than on building profit, and property right overpower the right for housing in the constitution even. So scholars though see a window of opportunity at a local level, which is also a level we perhaps should look at with more attention. They say that we could make use of devolution, strange enough, to return to a regulatory approach to land use planning and urban program, in this sense to protect and expand public land bank and all the privatization of public land and public assets that was set in motion at national level and pressure from the European level. And finally, the development of a unitary rental system based on the social market model. We know that it was absolutely instrumental to redistribute resources, prevent affordability crisis, and reduce urban inequality in Northern Europe. But the competition policy set at European level has really curbed a member state ability to produce such a system by constraining, to start with, the integration and competition of profit and non-profit sector in a single market. And the consequences are actually tremendous, terrible, not only for Northern European countries, but all across Europe indeed. So in this sense, I really fully agree with the underlying argument, final argument set on the report, that we cannot pursue our way toward a more universalist system without substantial changes in European policy and regulation. And I think this is the battlegrounds in which academia definitely could move more. And your work is really very good endeavor that goes in this direction and can really set the tone for all of us to follow. Well, thank you.
Thank you very much, Sonia. And now we leave the floor to Melissa. Merci, Lamarca. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I want to thank Simone and Luisa for the moderation, for the invitation to be here today. And I also wanted to begin by congratulating the authors of the report. Congratulations to Simone and Myrto and to all the other colleagues you worked with. I think you gave a very excellent overview of housing financialization in Southern Europe. And I'm very happy to also go after Sonia and Thomas, who I think gave a very good overview of dimensions of the report that I think that I completely agree with. I also think it's important to congratulate José Gusmão and his office for commissioning this report, because I think this is a great step. And really hope this can be a useful tool And it's great to be among Thomas, Sonia, and Manuel as a discussant. So in terms of my intervention, I wanted to make 2 comments and raise a question on issues arising in the report that relate to my work on housing financialization, my work in activism, specifically around mortgage indebtedness and debt resistance on the one hand, and the growth of real estate investment trusts in the rental market, both grounded in the context of what's going on in Barcelona and the metropolitan region. So hopefully I'll give a bit of a counterbalance to this broader overviews by bringing in some specific examples and things to think more about the implications of the report. So the first comment I wanted to make was more on housing financialization more broadly. I think it's important to underline that when the economy is booming, employment is growing, and the overall outlook is good, housing financialization does not appear to be a problem. You know, I think it seems positive, for example, package and selling mortgages on secondary markets, what we call securitization, because it extends lending. So these processes are seen as good, you know, generally speaking by that sector, but in this moment of growth, it's not necessarily a problem. And of course, housing financialization appears to increase access to housing through mortgages and expanding rental markets, even though, as we know, it hides increasing indebtedness, it connects people's lives into global financial flows and makes millions or even billions in profit for the rentier class. And as the report mentions, it contributes to gentrification, touristification, displacement. But when there's growth and people can pay their mortgage and the rent, the state and financial entities don't see this as a problem per se. So I think the problem, which I thought Thomas rose very well in terms of what is the problem with financialization, is that, of course, crisis is part of capitalism and it's cyclical. And when crisis arrives, this kind of speculative growth-driven model that drives housing financialization fails, and it spells disaster for people's everyday life, as the report discusses deepening existing socio-spatial urban inequality and canceling the gains that homeownership appeared to have given working class and racialized people. These points are stated in the report, but I thought it was important to emphasize them because the political and economic orthodoxy that sees housing financialization as a good thing focuses only on this upward growth moment, right? And always thinks falsely that crisis can be avoided and that crisis isn't something that will necessarily come. So of course, this orthodoxy is very neoliberal, as we know, rooted in a belief in markets and this false idea of trickle-down benefits. Getting into another point about specifically about the report recommendations, I really appreciated this part of the report because as a geographer and as a critical geographer, it's very nice to critique, but it's good and important to also have recommendations and think about ways to take action. I think what I had a lot of questions about, and it would be great to discuss in the discussion, is how we imagine or these transformations taking place, so how to implement these recommendations. And I was thinking through, you know, in the Spanish context, because a lot of these recommendations, social movements have been struggling for 8 years to make many of the changes proposed. So especially around mortgage debt, where, as I think Thomas mentioned, if you don't know, people in Spain are still liable for their outstanding mortgage debt once their home is foreclosed and they're evicted. And people have been struggling for rent control and all sorts of transformations of the legislative model around housing. So despite gathering 1.5 million signatures from citizens in Spain in 2014 to change the mortgage law, so this was a change to the law to stop evictions, to cancel outstanding mortgage debt during housing repossession and other changes, there's been dozens of enormous protests, hundreds of direct actions to physically block evictions, occupy bank-owned housing rescued by the state. And there's really only been very, very minor success in terms of this structural legislative change. And when I say minor, it's really like the details, not the heart of what's organizing the political economic system that makes housing financialization possible. And then what happens also in the Spanish context is when more significant legislation has been adopted, like Act 24, 2015 in Catalonia, which I'll mention later, which oblige large-scale landowners to rehouse evicted families. Or in Andalusia in southern Spain, the regional government adopted a law to expropriate bank-owned housing. The Spanish Constitutional Court overturns these because they create territorial inequality. So in essence, they're making some people in part of the country better off, and this is not fair. So it needs to be overturned. So simply speaking, I think many of the recommendations or all the recommendations of the report disrupt the very basis of the Spanish economic growth model. I think much of the Southern European growth model that depends on construction as one of the key growth dimensions. And in the Spanish context, as Thomas said, and in the report details, it's been this way since the Franco dictatorship. And this was carefully constructed over over half a century. And this is in chapter 4 of the report. So the recommendations in the report, like abolishing fiscal benefits for homeownership, promoting homeownership through means other than debt, regulating market rental housing, they're not in the interest of any political party or the Spanish elite. It's really, unfortunately, as simple as that. So aside from it not being in their interest, I think the politicians in Spanish elite would say that it risks in creating legal insecurity for private investors who have been purchasing millions of housing units across Europe. So in other words, regulating rental markets changes the rules of the game, and it risks driving away investors, which we know that governments are very wary to do in any respect. And of course, to secure the right to housing and more accessible, affordable housing, we can say this is a good thing, but I can't imagine any political figure being able to adopt such changes at the national level. More recently, the former leader of Podemos, Pablo Iglesias, was really pushing backing social movements claims from the Platform for Mortgage Affected People and other groups that were trying to change many dimensions of the legal framework. But the current president, Pedro Sánchez, these were kind of things that saying, no, this is not going to be part of our agreement. And so unless the socialists would have a majority government, and even in that case, it's unlikely to imagine a lot of these changes taking place. So I guess the ultimate question is, how do we implement these report recommendations, which I think are really fundamental if we're talking about creating more affordable, accessible, fair, just housing for everyone. And finally, before closing, I wanted to briefly comment on local and regional level action, which I was happy to hear Sonia raise this point about local action too. I really absolutely agree with the report's diagnosis about the role of the state in terms of enabling, promoting, and shaping housing financialization in recent decades. And while it's true that this larger political, economic, and legal framework has barely changed, which I just discussed, it's worthwhile to explain, I think, some regional and local level action that's at least addressing the negative consequences of housing financialization. So some of you may know that in 2015, a leftist coalition municipal platform led by Ada Colau and activists and intellectuals won the city council elections in Barcelona. And Ada Colau has been mayor. She's one of the founders of the platform's Mortgage Affected People. And in her time in government, she's attempted to better attend to the impacts of housing financialization. So some of the things they've done is creating a unit against residential exclusion, UCER, which basically collaborates with social services centers and housing offices in the city and also the district level in cities to stop or mediate evictions, and also helps to relocate affected households in decent accommodation. There are, of course, still popular mobilizations every day to block evictions that are organized by housing movements, but this unit against residential exclusion stops or mediates many of these. There's also been a move to increase the affordable housing stock by obliging developers to include 30% of their units as affordable, increasing the public rental sector by buying flats and buildings at below market rates, and promoting new affordable cooperative housing model, which is very small scale, but it's also thinking of a new way of protected housing in Spain. And also there's been a lot of work on controlling short-term rentals, although I think the question raised by Thomas about now coming out of the pandemic, what the responses will be is also questionable, because this is an important part of the economy and jumpstarting tourism again is fundamental. So I would say, while these have been important actions, they're really more like Band-Aid solutions because they're not addressing the structural dynamics the report discusses, although they are, of course, improving the social impacts, the negative social impacts. What I think that is important to highlight is in terms of regional action that is more structural, a success that's been obtained through social movements is from the Barcelona Tenants Union, the Sindicat de Llogateres, which was founded in 2017 to defend the right to housing and accessible, stable, and secure rent. They were behind driving legislative change at the regional level in Catalonia, and they created a rental law to control rent, and it was backed by many other housing movements and civil society organizations, and it was approved by the Catalan Parliament in September 2020. So far, it hasn't been overturned by this constitutional court, although there's been movements on the right to try to get this to change to overturn this law. But it's interesting because very recent studies have found that in the past year, the law has been active and prices have slowly been decreasing 5% and rental contracts have grown. So it's going against the neoliberal orthodoxy of, oh, people won't want to rent their flats. These laws don't work. It's working and it's making housing a little bit more affordable. But I think also we can see these, when I talk about my work, groups like the PA and other housing movements that occupy bank-owned housing with and for people with no housing alternative. They've been doing this for 8 years. And I think, if we consider that in the Spanish context, the banks who own these properties have almost all significantly benefit from public bailout funds in the wake of the 2008 crisis. And so people turn the housing into social housing. They kind of, I think, challenge this housing financialization process through these occupations and make housing social or public themselves. So in closing, I wanted to raise these local level institutional and especially social movement actions as a counterpoint to consider in this larger multi-scalar issue of housing financialization in Southern Europe. So we can think about also how power built from below can change or at least challenge housing financialization dynamics. So thanks again for the invitation. Looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Melissa. Okay, and now we'll leave the floor to our last speaker, Manuel Aalbers.
Thank you very much. I am now sharing my screen. I hope you can see it. And I will be putting it in presentation mode, which means that I don't see the time anymore. So if I'm speaking for too long, give me a reminder because I just see my own presentation now. And
okay,
we're just in the corner. Okay, thanks a lot for the invite. Great report. I'm happy to be here also with the other speakers. It's nice to be last also because I could actually make a few changes in my presentation, kick out a few slides because some things were discussed earlier and better by other people. So I could focus a little bit more. It's also the reason that I did a PowerPoint. I didn't plan to do that originally, but I had so many different things to reflect on the presentation that I thought it might be better to organize my own thoughts. So once I was doing that, it was already coming into a PowerPoint format. So I thought I might just share it with you as well. I am speaking here as the only one not based in Southern Europe. I have lived in Italy for a year, but that's about it. Often I would be referred to in Southern Europe as the Northern European, but I'm actually closer to Rome than I am to Stockholm. So I feel more like a Western European, I would say, than a Northern European. Also, the city that I'm based in right now, Brussels, is actually a city that is more than 50% people from the Mediterranean first or second generation. So not just Southern Europe, but also Northern Africa and Turkey, for instance, and Lebanon is another big group. So another thing to sort of open up the perspective a little bit. This is not a perspective from Northern Europe in that sense. It's a perspective of living in a neighborhood where Portuguese is the most common language on the streets because it has both Brazilian and Portuguese migrants where I live. And Spanish and Italian are less heard, but there's still a few places here where that's also common. Okay, so I will get into my comments on the report. Oh, I'm trying to go to the next slide here. Apparently my arrows didn't work. So now I'm going too fast. Hold on. So I was going to say I'm very happy with the report. It's a great overview. I've tried to do an overview on housing financialization more generally speaking, which is almost impossible if you want to keep that short. And I'm happy that Simone and Myrto took a bit more space, but also a bit more focus to do actually a great report. I learned a lot from it. I knew some of the papers they were citing, but not all of them. There's actually so much more out there than I was aware of. So that's already great. I also think it's a very systematic treatment, partly because they define different themes and different forms of financialization. So that made it, I think, much easier to read. I think it was Thomas who also mentioned that even for someone outside sort of the financialization of housing debate, it was easy to read. And I think that's partly because it's so well organized. So compliments for that. I also like the sort of the balanced treatment of, on the one hand, the discussion of commonalities within this group, but also the differences within the countries. But it's on this large part about differences and commonalities that I would also like to center my first set of comments around. And that has to do with the question, what makes Southern Europe different? What makes it special? What does it make it stand out? And then there's a discussion a little bit, but I don't think it goes in very far in that discussion about this being some sort of welfare model. This is a common discussion, familiaristic welfare model, Southern European welfare model, Mediterranean welfare model. But of course, the question is, does housing fit in there? And as we know from the literature, housing doesn't fit that well in welfare state topologies. Many countries that are together in welfare state topologies don't necessarily fit together well for housing. The other thing is, of course, that housing isn't just embedded in welfare. It is often very poorly embedded in welfare, and this is especially the case in Southern Europe, but not exclusively so. But it's also embedded more widely in capitalism. And of course, welfare itself is embedded in capitalism, but outside the spheres of purely welfare. So I think this requires a focus on the broader political economy as well. And then I think actually some of the countries he discussed are quite different. I think especially Greece and Spain are sort of the two extreme cases here that have very different political economies, despite some obvious similarities. If we look, for instance, at international capital flows, they were and remain more important in Spain, followed by Portugal, than they are in Greece, and Italy a little bit being between Portugal and Greece in these terms. And people often think here, well, international capital flows into housing is a lot of people buying second homes. But a lot of the international capital flows go into, for instance, buying up mortgage debt in Spain or buying up housing. And this is much less the case in Greece. So I think there's also some big differences here that maybe sometimes I think could deserve a little bit more attention. Also to see then how these countries in Southern Europe compare to other countries elsewhere in Europe or elsewhere in the world. Because I think once you start with the idea of writing a report on Southern Europe, even though you're going to stress the differences between the countries, you start treating it as one group. And I think there are important differences. And these international capital flows are an example, but also in terms of mortgage debt, securitization, REITs, etc. Some of the differences within this group of 4 countries may sometimes be bigger than the differences of individual countries in this group to individual countries in other groups. This arrow still doesn't work, although I keep clicking it. So often it's mentioned, well, home ownership rates in Southern Europe are very high. I'm not saying this report makes that point, but very often this is a common argument in the literature on housing in Southern Europe. And although this is somewhat true, we could say that it's not exceptionally high. Some of the highest home ownership rates are actually in Central and Eastern Europe. And if we actually look at these ownership rates, they are surprisingly similar, 72 to 77%. These are data from 5 years ago, so relatively recent. But if we compare that to, say, Ireland, Belgium, Luxembourg, but also Czech Republic, Slovenia, they are all also in the same range. So in a way, yes, this is something they have in common, but not just with each other, also with a wider group of countries. So it is interesting to look a little bit more about the story that is not just about Southern Europe. So this is a slide I've originally made for a different audience. And I'm talking about a country here in Europe where the home ownership ideology has been dominant for a long time, where already in the law in the late 19th century, it was considered preferred tenure. Different documents from the Vatican and more generally in Catholic thought were being used to naturalize private property rights. And new political parties also didn't really question this ideology. And there was an implicit form of asset-based welfare long before that concept was coined in an English language context. It's a country also that relies on self-building, on family support, on government subsidies, where social renting is relatively underdeveloped, where private renting is a poor alternative, and the ideal was and is owning outright, while increasingly the practice is one of mortgaged home ownership. So this would actually be a story that fits, I think, many Southern European countries quite well. I actually prepared this slide when I was asked to speak in Ireland, and I used the slides on Belgium, where I live right now, to show actually there's quite some similarities between Belgium and Ireland. But it's now nice, I didn't use anything, I didn't change anything in the slide except for the title. To show that actually we can also tell the story about Belgium to a Southern European audience, and it's quite recognizable. I think especially to Italians and to some extent to Spanish and Portuguese people, it's very recognizable. Maybe slightly less to Greek. I know less about Greek housing situation also in the other 3 countries, but I think it's interesting to see like, okay, this is not just a story about Southern Europe. This is a much broader story where there's quite some similarities also within countries that are not in Southern Europe. Then the other points that I want to make is that I like the distinction that was already made early in the report about housing financialization being about 2 different but related things. The first one being the increasing use of housing as assets in financial markets, and the other one about the increasing presence of financial actors in housing markets. So it's about assets and actors, to say it briefly. And then I thought, like, well, let's revisit how I discussed this before. And then in the middle here, you find my definition of financialization in general. And then for each of these elements, I have added something. And again, this is a recycled slide about how this relates to housing. And I think some of these elements pop up quite well in the report. If we look at these two blue boxes on top of the definition, I think these are things discussed also in the report, especially the idea of the different kind of financial actors coming in. Also, if we look at markets, the bottom right blue box, there is a bit of attention to this. But I think actually what the report does very well is the second part of the housing financialization, the role of financial actors. I think what is good, but could have been even stronger, is discussing the use of housing as assets in financial markets, and also the use of assets not just in financial markets, but also by homeowners and also by small landlords. A lot of landlords, whether in Southern Europe or elsewhere, are not necessarily big financial players, but they may still treat housing as a financial asset. Also in the mentality of people, housing is being treated increasingly as an asset, not exclusively, it's treated primarily as a home, but an asset is also becoming very important. So I think some of these, yeah?
Manuel, just, you have 2 minutes left.
Okay, yeah, thanks. So I think it's interesting to look a little bit more of the measurements which make something financial. So credit scoring, for instance, is one that I think is quite interesting. And it will be interesting to see how this is being used in Southern Europe. What we know from credit scoring is that it's not exactly the same in all countries, but we know very little about this. So I'm not saying this should have been in the report. This is maybe a little bit more like, what is one of the things we can develop further in the future? The other parts about the housing as assets that I think could be developed more is this idea of home as an investment good. So not just the discourses in the financial sectors, but the narratives and discourses used by people themselves. And I think here we see a really big contradiction between the nature of the discourses that support home ownership as the normalized form of tenure and the reality of financialized home ownership. And again, I think this is something we see in Southern Europe, but also in other countries. And this comes from the same paper on Belgium where we describe this. And I think it would be interesting to get a bigger understanding, a broader understanding of this, how this works in different Southern European countries. So we see that there's this contradiction between the discourses on the one hand and the reality on the other hand. Declining affordability features very prominently in the report. Progressively less conservative housing finance. When I started doing my interviews in Italy in 2004, people were telling me like, oh, it's a very conservative housing finance system. You can't get big mortgage loans. We don't do any securitization. And all of these things were already not entirely true at the time, and they're less true today. And this is the same in many countries, I think. There's a discourse by the industry, by the government, that it's all fine, the housing finance, it's a conservative system compared to other countries, no subprime lending. People say there's no securitization, even though many Southern European countries also do mortgage securitization, as the report shows. And we also see increasingly fractions in inequality of housing-based wealth, and we see the absence of tenure neutrality. And the last thing is not a new thing. This is, in a way, you could say, this has started by the foundation of this sort of priority of homeownership. So the financialization of housing, in short, is undermining the stability of housing realities and practices. And this is where I get to the end. I had a slide here that I assumed I wouldn't be able to discuss in detail, so I won't. It's actually very similar to the list that's in the report of different things. And I think Simone has seen an earlier version of this, and so have some of the other people in the audience. But I think we often tend to focus really on the financialization itself and less on the alternatives. So I was very happy Melissa was discussing some of that in more detail, which allowed me to take out some of the information I had on that. So I think it's very important, and I see the next session of this two-part session next week is going to focus much more on this mobilization. So that would be interesting. And I think this is something we need to have more conversation about, alternatives to financialization rather than just critiquing it. I think that would be a way to go. And this is where I would like to end. Thanks for your attention.
Okay, thank you very much, Manuel. Now I leave the floor to Simone again to some brief final comments, and then we will open the debate.
Maybe I was thinking I can say something at the end, so we open up right before José, and so we open up to the discussion. And I don't know if Myrto, because she's there, if she wants to add something before, because I mean, it's not just me. Myrto, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Hey, everyone. Thank you very much for organizing all of this event. No, I'm listening to everything, and I agree with everyone that talked already. For me, it's really interesting to see what's going to happen now, especially after the pandemic. So not after, maybe in the
post-pandemic period. So for me, I would like to continue looking at this, maybe in the near future. Yes, so we can start discussing if you also want. Thank you.
Okay, so we can open the debate. I will take the occasion for some short comment myself. So first of all, I'm very glad that we had this debate today before of the second event we organized on housing crisis and social mobilization, because I think that they're very much connected. As also Melissa was introducing, I also really share the idea that social pressure is really fundamental in this kind of changes, and it is something that it's needed to push governments towards the individuation of alternatives, since it is a very political issue at the end of the day. And I'm quite interested in seeing how this context of COVID-19 that is actually producing the need to address a renovated urgent housing issue will get a new centrality in legitimizing national and extra-national institutions in addressing new solutions, and also how much it will give a new leverage to local mobilization to propose alternatives from the bottom. So, well, thank you very much for. And I wanted also to add one thing on what Manuel was mentioning now. I did some research on the context of Rome and Berlin, and I could really much see the patterns that are described in this report on Southern Europe reflected in what happened in a city like Berlin, for example, in his passage from the former social state to the capitalist state, and how it was this big change of huge quantity of housing, public housing, produced the discourse of the need for privatization, securitization, etc. And yeah, so I think that sometimes besides the west, east, or north, south, there is also a matter of political context in which this kind of processes happen, that it's quite interesting to observe. This is just to have some more comments to add to the discussion. I leave the floor to the rest of the debate.
Yeah, I've seen there is Giovanni, Marco, and Rita, so we can take more than one. Giovanni.
Okay, thank you very much. I have a question because I was thinking how inspiring this conversation could be for a meeting I have on housing the next Monday, and I will have to speak about participation. And I was wondering, for example, in the Portuguese law, in the new framework for housing, we have a lot is insistence on the importance of participation. And I was wondering how much participation could be something that challenge the dominant narrative, and so also the financialization, or according to what was Manuel saying in the end of his intervention, it could eventually reinforce some position, because I'm not sure. I see it as an ambiguous element, because there are narrative of wishes that could be reinforced, but it's true also that people do not anything in reality about the mechanism of financialization, and so how do they pay for that? So I was wondering what type of participation we need in order for people to challenging the present narratives and the ideology, as Manuel was calling them, in relation to private ownership.
Okay, thank you very much, Giovanni. Now, Marco.
Yes, thanks everybody, obviously, for the super good work. I have two questions. One is basically to everybody. One is regarding the fact that the narrative, sorry, I can't speak, so no question. I will write it down.
Yeah, maybe you can write it down. Sorry for that. Anybody else that want to?
I have a question. Hello?
Hello, Rita.
Do you hear me?
Go ahead. Yeah,
Sorry, I don't have a camera, so I cannot connect the camera. Well, thank you for the presentations, and the discussion is very interesting. And I read also the report, and I like it very much. But my big question is to the different intervenants is, yes, of course, governments can do different kinds of things, and there are a lot of this process that could be reversed and can be. And but my question is, how central is today housing to the process of capital accumulation? And of course, it's not just housing, but real estate and housing in that. And I think this is important to think and to question, to think about how can we face this problem and to reverse and to struggle against it. So that is my question. And the importance of the actors. Manuel was speaking about actors, yes. And what are the kind of actors we are facing? That is the bank system and the funds and the big financial players. So I would like to have some comments about this, to think about the possibilities to face this problem. Thank you.
Okay, anybody else?
If I may?
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
I already wrote. I wanted to ask to Melissa if she can suggest some references about the achievement of the housing movements and about the municipalist experience of Barcelona to which she referred. And I mean, I know a little bit about the housing movement of Barcelona, and I think even before the rise of municipalist experience to the government, the squatting practice was so diffused and common that this actually was creating a huge problem to the financialization of that market, for example. But I was thinking if she was referring to something else out of those very important grassroots practices.
Okay, thank you, Erasmo. Anybody else? Okay, there are no more questions. We can open the floor for the speakers. Who wants to start answering?
You decide.
I decide. Okay, so let's do opposite order of the speakers. So if Manuel wants to start.
Yeah, that's okay. So there's a lot of questions also in the chat, I see. So I'm not sure I understood Giovanni's question about participation correctly, but maybe some of it in Rita's questions I can also address. So Rita was asking, is housing central to capitalism? It won't surprise her that my answer is yes, very much so. Housing and real estate are definitely central to capitalism. And there's different ways to think of this. And I could easily talk for another 10 minutes about it, which I won't, no worries. But one way is to think about what financial institutions really do. And what financial institutions really do is that housing and real estate is for them the biggest thing they finance. So it's not just for us as individuals, if we may own a house, that it's our biggest investment ever, but even for banks and financial institutions, it is the biggest thing they invest in. In many countries, it's even a majority of the things they invest in. So it is, without housing and real estate, you could say capitalism as it is falls apart, which is maybe an interesting thing to think about. If we wanted to fall apart, that housing and real estate could be a good way to start. But to reform it also, it would be a good way to start. And I think here there is a problem, and maybe this also tackles the idea of the question of participation of Giovanni, is that yes, we have tenant unions, tenants organizers, and in Spain we have something like the PA that also organizes people with mortgages. But I think what is missing in most places is a broad coalition between people being exploited through housing in different ways. And I think it's also very hard to form a coalition like that. So although I think it is a necessity for people to realize, okay, rising house prices isn't in most people's interests. It is in most people's interest that housing prices are actually affordable, stable perhaps for some people, that the idea that you can make money on your house seems very nice, but very often people just need that money then to support their children because otherwise they can't, which is in itself is a very uneven situation. But even for the people who make money on it that way, they often need it to support their kids. So I think we need to break out of that kind of thinking and form a coalition between people who rent from the bank, that is, have a mortgage, and people who rent from a landlord, because in the end, they both pay to different fractions of capital. That is very abstract, but I do think that is one thing to think about, the centrality of housing to capitalism, and also how to move forward from there. I also saw a question from Sjoerdje in the chat, which is about differences in housing financialization in urban and rural areas. I think it depends a lot. On the one hand, I'm not sure in each country if the distinction between urban and rural is the most useful. I think in more densely populated countries, it may not be the most relevant distinction. Also, if we think of UN definitions of urbanization, I live in a country that I think is the land is 75% urbanized and the population is 95% urbanized. That may be different in larger countries which are less densely populated. But I'm not sure if urban versus rural is necessarily the best way to think across these changes. Also, the idea that housing financialization is necessarily concentrated in larger cities or in more expensive cities is only partially true. If we look at the housing financialization, especially of rental housing, a lot of that also happens in more peripheral cities, maybe not per se in the countryside, but also in more peripheral cities. In Germany, this is definitely the case, where there's a lot of stories about Berlin, but relatively speaking, Berlin is not the biggest case of the financialization of rental housing. There are smaller cities in North Rhine-Westphalia in the west, or cities like Dresden in the east, or Halle, where this is actually much more progressed than in Berlin. And these are in their way all some sort of peripheral places within Germany, just as another example. I see that other questions popped up for Marco, but I haven't been able to read that yet. So maybe this is a good point to hand over to the next discussants.
If you want, I can just read the Marco Beverini question since he wouldn't speak. So he asking, the narrative of home ownership and of housing as a good investment is self-reinforcing also through the media pushing people to consider it a safe investment and to buy. I think one point is to bring a counter-narrative about it. And second, the matter is so complex that it's very hard even to understand for researchers. We have to study some basics of finance to understand. And this makes it even harder to mobilization. It is much easier to ask for more public housing than to stop financialization. Shall we, as researchers, work to simplify the matter, or shall we maintain its complexity? So everybody heard the question. And now we can move to second, okay. I don't know if there is somebody that wants to answer specifically. Otherwise, maybe Melissa can intervene.
Sure, thank you, Luisa. I'm going to try to respond briefly to all the questions. So in terms of Giovanni's question about participation, I was thinking about this, and I think the main issue is that the kind of legislative, the laws that are created almost never, there's very little public input or participation in these processes. And I was thinking, for example, my experiences in the housing movement in the platform for mortgage affected people, that when people's debt is securitized, for example, people don't know their debt is securitized until they can't pay. And then the bank tells them, no, we've sold your debt, or their debt was securitized and they sold the debt to some other company. So I think this is a huge issue, is that people there isn't a participation happening. That's at least how I would characterize it in the creation of these legislative processes. Listening to Manuel's response, it made me think about the coalition among different housing groups. And I wanted to mention that in Catalonia a few years ago, there was a Congreso Habitatge, there was a housing congress. So that was attempting to bring together all the different movements that work on housing, from mortgages, rent, squatting, and to kind of work together to build campaigns and to build this sort of thing. But this is a bit different from participation, I think, and at least I think of it that way. In terms of Rita's question, I completely agree with Manuel's response about housing is central to processes of capital accumulation today. Absolutely. In Spain, this is absolutely true. And it's because of the historic roots of the process, which I think the report covers quite well. The actors we're facing, I think there's a mix. I mean, investment funds, at least in this, I'm talking in the Spanish context, the investment funds coming in, the new real estate investment trust, which is a company that manages real estate and they don't pay taxes. There's also, as some point somebody raised, large landlords in cities, in Barcelona in particular, the Catalan bourgeois bought 15 flats, so they're landlords as well. So it's like they're rentiers because they can live off of this rent. So I think this is also what makes it challenging, is that there's a mix of different actors that are being faced. And then there's also in the rental sector, of course, people who have one property who are renting and they depend on this rent to pay their bills. And so I think this makes it quite complicated, at least especially in the Spanish context where rental properties are very fragmented and it's mostly small owners. Erasmo's question, I'm happy if you send me your email, Erasmo, to send you some references for the housing movement and municipal experiences. In terms of your question on squatting, I was referring to 2011, 2012, which was when the PA started squatting bank-owned buildings for families who were evicted. The first occupation was a family who was evicted from their home, and the movement decided with the family to go back and to squat their home that was repossessed by the bank. So this is kind of there is, of course, squatting movements from the 1980s that have been active a long time in Barcelona. And there's some tension between these newer movements and the historic movements. So this is kind of another question. But that's what I was referring to when I was talking about the squatting. And finally, Marco's point about the counter narrative about homeownership. Yes, I think there's a double side here. On the one hand, what's happening, I'm seeing, at least in Spain, is that the industry is built in this counter narrative. They're saying renting is flexible, renting is good because you can, be mobile, and they're trying to build this new, ideology around counteracting homeownership, which is completely problematic and hugely problematic. But then the other problem, I think, is that the alternative to homeownership is not stable. So if you're a renter, you don't have, your rights are really poor, you face rent increases, you don't have the same power, so to speak, because homeownership is so secure in terms of the housing tenure. I think this is a big challenge to think about. And then finally, to simplify the matter, to the question about, should we simplify this question about finance, or what should we do? For me, I think what's really important to talk about people's experiences, because for me, from my activism in the PA for many years, it's like when you can tell a person's story. If they bought their mortgage, then this company went bankrupt and the debt was sold to whatever. And then, they get caught up in these complex financial flows. So that shows very well, I think, how financialization is lived. And I think those lived experiences can help explain the complexity.
Okay, thank you very much, Elisa. And I don't know if Sonia wants also to intervene and say some comments on questions. Or Thomas, please go ahead.
Okay. I can't find all the questions, so I gave up. I'll just comment on 2 or 3 that I have been able to record. Rita's comment and the responses by Manuel and by someone else also responded. Yes, yeah. I would say that housing and fixed capital is always essential for capitalist accumulation. Sometimes it becomes more important than others, and today, and because of financialization, housing and fixed capital in general is a primordial destination for investment, and it is also reflected in the ways inequalities are growing, and they are much more based increasingly not on income but on wealth accumulation, and wealth accumulation is quite closely linked with fixed capital. The other issue discussed was home ownership, rent tenure, in fact, and discourses. Tenure is not always the same thing. If you are in a developed welfare state of the 70s and you are a tenant with increased rights and all that, then rent may be an adequate place to be. If you are in a dominated by home ownership situation where rent is residual, no rights, etc., then the position within home ownership is really secure, and it creates an ideology, it creates even a culture, and reproduces it. So it's something that you have to position within the specific time, place, context that you analyze. It's not a through time thing. What comes out of the report and from Manuel's presentation is differences among the countries, similarities among the countries, not only within the Southern European context, but Ireland, Belgium, or Eastern Europe. Yes, on all those differences, how does financialization work on? Does it make an important difference, or financialization has worked a bit like a bulldozer and really marginalized these differences? I don't have an answer for that. And the last thing I wanted to raise is, and this is again a question rather than an answer to anything. The political difficulties to promote movements, answers, political answers, coalitions, alliances, which are based on housing issues. Even in Spain, where movements are within the Southern European context, probably the most ardent, the most vigorous, because probably problems are the most important. You have movements, but they go up to a certain level. Municipal level, local state level. They don't translate at the national level, at national politics. Housing remains a little bit invisible in terms of an item on the central agenda. And this is connected to what I said in my first, what's the sociological landscape that housing today, financialized housing, is creating, and how the left can bring the pieces together. So it's a question.
Okay, Simone, no, thank you very much, Thomas. And Simone, if you want to.
Yeah. Sonia texted me with apologies because her building went without light. So she felt maybe she will be able to join us before we say bye. But yes, I'm happy to say really a few things before giving the last word to José. And I mean, of course, I'm very grateful to our four speakers and to all the comments and questions and to the, because it has been, I think, a nice conversation. And so I will just make 3 or 4 bullet points. And that comes from, I mean, I'm happy that some messages that we wanted to send have somehow went through. And the first is this idea of the need to restating the cyclicality of crisis within capitalism, which for me is important in terms of historicizing financialization. I mean, I also think in terms of long-term histories of world economy analysis on cycles of capitalism, but it's also important in terms of historicizing financialization, which nowadays seems to be like an overarching, all-encompassing field, but things have been different in the past and will be different in the future in this sense. So looking at the history maybe help us escape, you know, the fetishization of financialization at some time we feel because of its powerful impact in times of crisis. I'm also particularly happy that the idea that these policy recommendations have been listened to, because very often, as we all know, the recommendation is something we put there at the end because we want to feel a bit better after having criticized everything. In this case, it's where we started, in the sense that what we've been requested to do was to produce a document that could be useful for pushing forward policy change. And in this sense, now it's José and his colleagues, the ball is to them to try and push these changes. But at the same time, I agree with some of the comments, particularly Melissa's, in the sense that in the present political scenario, sometimes this type of recommendation may seem a bit out of place, like no one is gonna do this. But this, I think, is inherent to the ambiguities of trying to do policy and not just politics in such an ambiguous context as contemporary capitalism, which of course brings me to the final issue, which is politics. And I really appreciated this mention that Manuel made between the conflict between the discourse and the reality, and in this sense the need to open, to push this clash between what is like presented to be and what happens. I mean, I'm thinking of a paper by Manuel and Fernandez on this new wave of securitization, which is being promoted by the European Commission as a way to finance small and medium enterprises. And that's, pardon my French, bullshit. It's just another way to launch financialization sold in the name of stimulating real economy. And so that's maybe where there is space for pushing a different discourse. And definitely the other dimension is contentious politics. And we've been interested in it in Portugal with this project Hopes, on which Goya Cornero is the principal investigator. I mean, also the cases mentioned by Melissa are pretty interesting in the sense that even in Spain, where we have had the strongest and fiercest movements and activism during the last decade or so, not much has changed in terms of policies. And so the final question will be, so what? Yeah, sometimes I think I agree with Thomas' provocation. We need to be Luddites, you know, like fight against the machine. Or maybe there is another way forwards. And in this sense, my obsession in the last few years has been that as important as local mobilization is, I believe that the European scale is such a fundamental scale precisely to overcome those kind of there is no alternative rhetorics, that when you are in Portugal and you talk with a socialist minister, they say, oh yes, I agree with you, but we cannot let tourism go, etc., etc. I think that the real scale where these types of discussions can be made beyond this type of peripheralizing discourse is at the European scale, be it within the European Union or outside the European Union. That's I'm becoming skeptical about that, but still at the European scale. And that is, of course, a huge challenge. But frankly, I start to think that it's the real pragmatic way forward, changing everything at the European level. And now I'm starting to think that naive is thinking that we can change things at the local or national level. So this idea of scaling up, of course, without giving up at the local level is probably what, in terms of politics, and I mean, how to build a European left beyond the attempts by the M25, but which at least has been the only attempt to build a European left-wing party with all its limits, etc. But are we able to do something like that, even starting from academia and from the field of housing? José Gusmão will tell me there is already European left, so I would like to hear from him at the end. And thanks everybody. It has been very nice and interesting.
José Gusmão, would you like to say a few words?
Yes, quick ones, because this is taking place at plenary week in Strasbourg, which is the most busy week we have on our calendar. I think that this was really interesting. I think added a lot to the presentation we had, the previous one, because we had a different kinds of contribution, and I wouldn't presume to go into the truckload of ideas that appeared in this conversation. Also because the housing issue is at the intersection of many different policies, some of which I know a little and some of which I don't know at all. So I would just, as a form of feedback, give you some of the topics that we've been discussing both at the left bloc in Portugal and also at the European left, where we have very different opinions on what the role of the European Union should be on these issues. Actually, we have all the opinions available within our group, and I won't bore you with our internal debates on that. And of course, in different areas, there are some things that have to be done at the European level, and others that don't have to be mixed, or things like that. In the Portuguese case, and apparently not just a Portuguese case, housing was a part of the welfare state that wasn't really ever built. I mean, when we had the democratic revolution, we were still at the stage where we had enormous slums in urban areas. So the priority of housing policy in the beginning of our democracy was to deal with homelessness and slums in the country. So there was a very strong bias, which I think remains to this day, to think about housing policy as, especially public housing, as social housing. And that hasn't changed. For the most part, in the political spectrum in Portugal, that's how public provision is thought of, as social policy. There is also, there's a second bias, which is the bias, housing ownership, which affected the financial regulation framework, tax policy, housing incentives for a very long time, and it still does actually, and really shifted the focus away from looking at the rental market, where we've moved on and forth from rental regulation, which was the traditional solution, to rental market liberalization, which is the most modern tendency. I would point out the importance of, at least in the Portuguese case, of labor market change. Because when we had the wave of financialization in the housing market in Portugal, incomes were never very high, so it wasn't possible to go for a model of housing ownership for everybody. But we still have labor market regulation, which is still based on permanent contracts. And one of the problems that is becoming more and more serious in Portugal is, as we have an entire generation now that is almost exclusively in precarious labor relationships, we have a very sharp divide in access to credit between those who do have access to credit and have a big advantage in access to housing. And in many cases, especially if you're talking about people under 30 years old, they will probably have less housing costs paying a mortgage than they would have renting the same apartment. This is very common. This happened to me when I bought my first house. So what do I think are some of the areas on which we can do more stuff and more urgently, and not just in the long run? I would say that there are two main objectives in the long run for countries like Portugal. One is to have a public housing stock that we don't have, not by a mile, to have 20–30% of public housing. This is something that will have to be done over a scope of several years. And also, I think the issue of public provision has to be put also in the side of credit, of having a much tighter regulation on housing credit, which doesn't necessarily mean that it will become more accessible, but I think that's something that has to be put on the agenda. We have to, I think the aspect of regulating the financial market in housing credit means that we need to get the risk in the financial institutions and to make it impossible for those financial institutions to get rid of the credit risk, as they have done in the past with very negative consequences. So I don't think that all left-wing policies for the housing market will necessarily be good news for instance, property owners, even small property owners, because I think we will have to discriminate on the uses that are being given to housing. And it's different to tax a small property owner that is renting his properties long run, or someone who is doing nothing with them, or who is using them as with touristic uses and so on. And I think that we do have several instruments that we can use, even at the national level. And one that obviously interests me a lot because it's closer to my area of work is taxation policy. There's a lot that can be done, especially towards financial concentration of ownership, which is a big problem in Portugal, because one significant difference in housing as a financial asset, which it has become, is that unlike most financial assets, it's not mobile. That's a big advantage in the field of taxation. When we look at the problems that arise when we try to tax financial assets, we always have to deal with the issue of evasion, capital flight, and we have to put withholding taxes in the mix. So it's always more complicated than it has to be with housing. And for instance, the taxation of real estate investment funds, which is, at least in Portugal, and I think it's generalized, a big taxing scandal. They actually have a taxing advantage when compared to small owners. And that is dealt with very, very quickly, and it can be dealt with very quickly. We're with very little side effects, I think. But on the long run, I would say that public provision is the most solid response, and it has to be seen not just from the side of housing provision, which is important, but also on the side of changes in the financial system. It was mentioned by several speakers, the debate on housing as a commodity or as a social or human right. And I think we have to look at currency, credit, the financial system also has something that has an inherent public interest. We were once in a conference on monetary policy in which a quite mainstream economist made a point that I think is very important. She referred to the currency as a public good, and as a public good, and currency and credit are the same thing, has a public good. It has to be managed, taking into account the very significant role that it has in several other areas that are central to the welfare state. So I would agree that regulating the financial system is a very important objective, but I think a part of that regulation is having a very significant part of the financial system being public, and I'm actually being modest about it because I have become more and more radical when it comes to the ownership of the financial system as I've looked.
Thank you, Jose. If you can close your intervention, maybe we can.
Yeah, I was actually. When it comes to content, I'm over. I would really like to thank Simone's study. It's been very helpful both for our work here at the Parliament and also to our work in Portugal, because obviously the political guidance in these aspects is very closely related. And I'm pretty sure that we will be working with him, and I hopefully some of you in the future in getting to know better some of these dynamics. So thank you all, and see you next time.
Thank you very much, Jose. So we have this advantage of an online event in which we can get a little bit more time of the time that was at the beginning intended to be. So if everybody can keep following still maybe the last 10 minutes, I will leave the floor again to Simone, who wants to make a last comment.
Yeah, just a sentence, because it's something I should have said and I forgot, which is important, you know, and it's saying thanks to José, actually, Maria Molejola and the office, because, you know, very often we scholars are concerned, you know, that by taking funds from some specific sources, we will be, pushed to give, the type of outputs, etc., etc. And actually what happened here, first, we've been left completely free to do whatever we wanted, that we agreed on what was the topic, and then it was complete freedom. And actually in the first version of the report, we had written a more moderate recommendation. It says, oh, look, but this is, for the politicians, etc. Maybe, and then it was just actually pushing us to say, but why here you say regulating? I don't remember what is the detail. Don't you think it should be abolished? Yes, I do, but I thought, yeah, say it. So in this sense, it's important to say that it's not true that pressure on academic freedom is necessarily correlated with ideological, but with the fact of coming from an ideological and political position. And so that was a beautiful experience also for that reason. And that's all I had to say to conclude. Luisa.
Okay, thank you very much for everybody for participating, and mainly to our very special speakers. Thank you for participating today. And you are all invited to our next event. It's a webinar that will be held on the 17th on housing crisis and social mobilization. So we will try to discuss this topic from a more activist point of view. And I think will be very interesting to discuss also for all the people that was participating today, how financialization also can end up depoliticizing the housing issue. It's something that I was thinking about while we had this last discussion, and could be very interesting to go through this point next time. So we really hope to see you on the 17th. Thank you again for participating, and well, have you all a nice day. Bye-bye.
Bye.